Well, the federal government has laid out its plan to make social media safer for kids. It's called the Safe Social Media Act, and it aims to regulate social media services and chatbot services. Under this legislation, these platforms will have to meet 3 core duties: to protect children, to act responsibly, and for social media sites to make certain content inaccessible. That includes an obligation for those sites to implement an age restriction on accounts for children under 16 years old. Now, these new regulations will be enforced by a new Digital Safety Commission. And for more on this, I'm joined now by the Minister of Culture and Identity, Mark Miller, who joins me in the studio. Minister, good to see you. Thanks for racing over after your press conference. We appreciate you doing that.
Pleasure.
There is a fair amount there, and we carried your press conference live, so we've seen a lot of the discussion on that. But I have a couple of questions I hope you can help me with on specific things. The duty to immediately remove content, the sexual content, the non-consensual deep fakes and revenge porn, as people would call it, that's a no-brainer. I understand that completely. But is that the extent of what has to be taken down? You have these 7 other categories of harmful content: bullying a child, foments hatred, incites violence, terrorism. What is the strength of the law in getting these types of content off social media?
It's an extremely important question, David, because in all these things you struggle with the notion of hierarchy of rights.
Right.
In some of the most egregious situations, kiddie porn, non-consensual sharing of images, as you said, it's a no-brainer. These things shouldn't be up there. They should be taken down within 24 hours. The actual fact that they are up causes people to self-harm, causes the bullying that you referenced. It also, sadly, when a kid decides to die by suicide, it re-victimizes families that have to see this stuff shared forever. So it's important that that crap gets taken down. As to the other stuff, we could have a debate on what needs to be taken down. I think the importance of those 5 other categories of harms are that platforms will be responsible to take proper and adequate measures to reduce the exposure of kids in particular, but everyone, to that type of harm. It will impose safety by design requirements and platform requirements where the platforms themselves could remove it if they don't follow the user guidelines that'll be changed. As you noted earlier, there are other countries in Europe and Australia where a kid's experience online is notably better by the laws that have been passed and that we are admittedly catching up to. So there's a number of cascading effects that I think that'll be good as a part of this law, but when it comes to the most egregious expressions of harm, that crap needs to be taken down within 24 hours.
Okay, but I guess, it is subjective, I guess, if something foments hatred, right? Like, you can have an argument on it, or whether it incites violence, you can have an argument on it, right? And so is that why these are not as prescriptive as say, the other, like the intimate images restrictions?
Well, what we want to make sure is that, and again, these are very tight definitions that follow existing legislation that people can be sued under if they don't remove it, but you don't want to leave that responsibility necessarily in the harms of the victims after the damage is done. So the responsibility clearly on platforms is to make sure that those extreme occurrences are reduced and indeed, we hope, eliminated. But again, this is not an exercise in perfection. It's in moving the ball forward and making sure that people's experience online, particularly kids, is markedly better than it is today.
So the ban comes in place when the legislation passes the House of Commons, the Senate, and gets royal assent. Then there's a period of time where the regulations get established and then a regulator is set up. So there could be a gap where Facebook, for example, can't give accounts to people under the age of 16, may implement compliance methods, but has no regulator to go to. I mean, do you foresee that as a possibility to get the exemption to bring them back? I mean, do you see that as a possibility where there's a ban in place and no way to get around it, even if a company complies?
So strictly speaking, the law comes into force by a decision by the Government Council. Fully expect that to have that moratorium placed. The timeline is an aggressive one to get a commission up and running. It'll be phased. Obviously, a commission would be seized with the compliance discourse that has to happen with platforms, with AI chatbot services, but also compliance with the law. It's a dangerous game of chicken for platforms to arbitrage that and say, well, we'll just wait. There are plenty of laws out there that people break. Otherwise, we wouldn't have courts if the laws were perfect and everyone observed them. But we want, to your point, I think importantly, for these laws to be effective, and that's why the importance of the commission that'll be phased up into what I think is an aggressive time frame of about 18 months.
But I'm seeing a scenario where, no disrespect to government, but the tech companies may tend to move a bit faster. So they may move faster now with the broad signal you've given them on compliance more quickly than you can get the regulation set up and get the regulator set up so they can apply for the exemption to say, look, we've done the homework. Let's give us our ability to give kids accounts back.
Look, in the hopeful situation that platforms finally see where the puck is and start skating to it before it gets there, and government is catching up, I think they can forgive us a couple months. I am hopeful, and indeed the work starts now. Obviously, the law needs to pass. We need to have a discussion with parliamentarians, with the Senate, to make sure that it does pass, and with society. Obviously, we'll entertain any reasonable contribution that parliaments from any side of the party can have, but we want this to be in place as quickly as possible and for the law to be in effect. That will include the expectation that platforms start adjusting now and follow these very basic minimum duties to take down the most extreme garbage within 24 hours, act responsibly, and protect kids, which they're not doing now, and indeed in many states in particular, because damages are higher in certain particular states, are getting quite significantly sued for and losing. So
it starts with a ban on use to essentially force a compliance framework upon the companies, right? That you lose access to your future customers and current customers under the age of 16 without these changes to the content moderation principles, the way your algorithms work, the addictiveness of your platform, and just the fundamental concept of it to make it a safer space for everyone before you get the kids back. How did you land on that as opposed to just the blanket ban like we see in Australia or, an aggressive ban on specific types of content beyond the explicit ones that you've outlined here?
Well, first and foremost, we want kids' experience online to be much better than it is today, and harm in these 7 egregious categories to be significantly reduced. I think if we'd gone out with a ban and nothing else, people would have seen it for what it would be, which is something that would have real questions as to whether it's effective and its sufficiency, particularly in a context where we are catching up to a number of countries that we compare ourselves often favorably to, but not in this case. This is a Canadian law, so we did have to tailor it carefully to what the Canadian experience online is, where we are, who we are as a people, making sure we're respecting people's respect for privacy. Private messaging, for example, is excluded. Not that bullying can occur and often does occur on those services, but that for us was a bridge too far. We thought we needed to keep it very much focused on really the egregious harms that are occurring online, that are creating what we see is happening in hospitals, and really making sure that platforms have that very basic minimum responsibility to reduce what they're responsible for hosting.
Right, so it's harm reduction as opposed to harm elimination, to sort of use, because it is difficult to police all the behavior that happens online, but I wonder about some of the more aggressive stuff that you see maybe in the public spaces of social media, moving to these exempt private spaces that you talk about, right? They can go into Discord, Roblox has become its own thing, as my kids have played games there and they don't use that platform anymore, but the private messaging can become more the focus for some of this, right? This could be the next challenge you face here.
Yeah, and I think as a society and as a government, we have to look at what perhaps the unintended consequences of this law is, perhaps adapt the responsibility of the Commission, perhaps modify certain provisions for more flexibility. That is a process that will continue to be ongoing. I would venture to think that if this law had passed a year ago, it might not have had the robust compliance mechanisms that we are asking, and very basic mechanisms we are asking AI chatbot services to observe in the wake of Tumbler Ridge. So this is a fast evolving technology and space where technology is causing a ton of disruption. Right. But we believe that this type of law is a very basic minimum and can modestly keep up with it.
Well, I know you answered this in the press conference, but you're not including a duty to report sort of the behavior. We learned that the shooter in Tumbler Ridge was exploring options and advice on how to execute the plan in an AI chatbot. And you said there was a grievous human error failure on the reporting there. Like they had internal reporting out policies and it wasn't complied with. But making it a legal obligation gets around the reliance on tech companies to have internal policies, does it not? I just wonder, how close were you to doing that? Because it seems to me that is not an onerous obligation to put on these billion-dollar companies that when you see this type of behavior, alert the local authorities.
When we discussed this as a government, we looked at what the obligation is for any person to report any crime, or where that reporting does exist, and frankly to consider the reality of what happened in Tumbler Ridge. AI did, in a sense, catch this. What that particular chatbot service did and said is still something of much analysis, but there was a real human failure here in the compliance group of OpenAI. And that reporting, while the mechanism was in place to have that discussion with police, did not reach the threshold that it would today if they had used the same standards that OpenAI uses. What we have decided and settled on is a mandatory transparency mechanism where we ask platforms and AI chatbot services to report the incidents that they're seeing, report what their standard is of reporting to the police, how many times that has occurred, and what that actual standard is and how many times it's been used. So essentially it gets to that in a less direct way, but creates a compliance mechanism where we're saying to the public, look, this is the service you're using, this is what they have to do when they see an egregious event and who they have to report it to. And we feel that ecosystem does address a number of the challenges that we're seeing out there.
So, God forbid, a repeat of the behavior that preceded what happened at Tumbler Ridge shows up in the OpenAI chatbot again. Under these rules, they will call the police, they will contact the police, or they will publish it in a sort of like anonymized, cataloging of the number of complaints like issues like this that they see.
If you were to ask the OpenAI folks today, based on the standard that they have, whether they would have caught this incident based on their legal standard of imminence, the answer would be yes. I think the jump that we can't make is that any particular act or gesture would have absolutely prevented this catastrophe from happening, but I know that a law like this in place will significantly reduce the harm that kids are exposed to. And in the case of AI chatbots, make sure that any counseling that's occurring from those AI chatbots to people that perhaps are in a very difficult situation is safe by design. And the compliance groups within these heavily capitalized companies have a robust mechanism of reporting and address that issue of being able to flag the police when these events occur.
So just as a final question, because I've gone over time here, but the penalties are 3% of global turnover, the revenue, or $10 million, whichever is greater. And you can see in the concept of an OpenAI or whatever, you're getting into large numbers. But the overall ability to enforce that, like it would have to be a legal process to get the assets, because I'm sure they're not stored in Canada, right? You can't go get a sheriff's officer to go put a lien on it. And just, if an AI chatbot or a social media company says, fine, we'll give up the under 16 market in Canada. We're not going to comply. Do you geo-block those somehow? Do you firewall them from being accessed from inside Canada? How do you deal with the total non-compliers from having access to this market necessarily if they're not going to comply?
Well, one, if they want to have access to the market, they will have to comply. The Commission will, unfortunately, probably have to deal with some of these situations. In terms of executing, there are plenty of laws where a number of these well-capitalized companies exist where you can actually enforce, and there's that reciprocity that exists.
Right.
You don't want it to get to that. First and foremost, this is a regime to prevent and to reduce the harm that's occurring. And indeed, people aren't in Canada with platforms and OpenAI necessarily as a charitable act. They're there to make money, and if they want revenue from Canadians, they need to comply with our law.
Mark Miller, Minister of Canadian Identity and Culture. I don't think this will be our last interview on this topic. We appreciate you coming in on the day that you're rolling it all out. We appreciate it, sir.
Thank you, Dave.
But joining us now to help us digest all of this is Taylor Owen, who is the founding director of the Center for Media Technology and Democracy and an associate professor of public policy at McGill University. Taylor Owen, this is getting to be a regular thing. It seems like it was only a week ago we were talking about AI. Now we're back with this one.
It just keeps on coming.
Well, what do you make of the direction the government is taking here and the balance of measures they put on the table?
I mean, in many ways, this is an iteration of the last Online Harms Act. It takes the core of that bill, the key provisions of it, like standing up an independent regulator, having duties to protect kids and duties to act responsibly, that put the onus on the companies that are making these technologies and these products to ensure that they're safe before they enter the Canadian market. And to make certain kinds of content completely inaccessible, as you mentioned, non-consensual intimate images and child sexual abuse material. So it takes that core, which I think was the right core, honestly. I mean, I think that's built on what a number of other countries have done. It's taken those lessons and builds on that effectively. But it's added two sort of somewhat more controversial elements. One is a restriction on access to users under 16 as a condition of gaining access to that market, of putting in place a bunch of safety measures before they get access to that market. And it includes chatbots, which is new.
But the components of the measures they're putting in place, I'm looking at some of the reaction. You are far more versed in this space than I am, quite obviously. I see people like Michael Geis, who you would know well. He's a critic of this, saying the amount of uncertainty and to-be-determined aspects of this bill are astonishing. So much left to cabinet, future digital safety commission. Teenagers today concerned about losing access to social media don't have to worry too much about this will take years to implement. Now, that's on the exemption side. The ban's going to come in right away at royal assent, is what Mark Miller had to say. Then we'll figure out regulations and the regulator. Does this get to a more reasonable balance on how to deal with these companies in terms of focusing on the design and the content rather than sort of banning and fining sort of thing?
I mean, so it's not an outright ban. An outright ban doesn't ultimately work because it assumes that the products can never be made safe. And the very principle of this bill and of this regulatory or age-appropriate design approach is that actually regulations can incentivize companies to design safer products.
Right.
And I actually think that's the right approach. The question is how you make them do that.
Yes.
And it could be, and this is going to be one of the first trials in the world of this, of using a restriction of access as an incentive towards compliance. And I think that's probably the best way of thinking about this, that the restricting access to begin with is a tool to incentivize the companies to comply with the age-appropriate design code and the other criteria.
Yeah.
And it's going to be an experiment in that. Now, whether we're leaving too much for the commissioner is a really interesting question, because that's always a debate in legislation, as you would know far better than I would, about how much do you lock into legislation and how much needs to be left nimble enough to be left to a regulator. And I actually think something like an age-appropriate design code, for example, these are the features that a company would have to include in their products if the products are likely to be used by kids. And other countries have these, and these might include things like no infinite scroll, or no targeted advertising, or no allowing a non-friend adult to contact a child, right? So design features of the product. You would never want to spell those out in legislation because those are always going to be changing. So you need to leave some things, certainly, to the commission to decide. Now, whether we've left too much to that or something, to the commissioner is going to be something we debate, certainly.
Well, yeah, that's going to be the challenge because, the tech companies move with the mantra of move fast and break things. Government sometimes moves slow and still break things, which has maybe been the experience of some of this. But you need to be able to respond to this because putting in these restrictions will lead to adaptations of behavior and technology in ways we can't necessarily anticipate right now. And if it requires a whole new legislative process, you're going to be constantly playing catch up. And the minister's already conceded they're 5 to 10 years behind on this one. So, but how do you actively enforce that? Like, if I'm going to use Facebook just because it's, I'm not saying they're going to not comply, but, if Facebook doesn't, stop.
I mean, there is a history of that.
Well, yes, you could post this clip maybe on their platform, but, if they don't comply with the under 16 ban and they keep issuing accounts to people under the age of 16, in the absence of the regulator being in place, like, what do you do? Do they just stop? Do they get geo-blocked from being accessible in Canada? Do you have to do that kind of a thing? How do you make a chat bot stop being accessible to Canadian kids if it decides I'm just going to be an American chatbot and not comply with your laws? Like, how do you firewall that in the day and age of VPNs and all the other technology out there?
Yeah, I mean, we regulate all sorts of companies that are based outside of Canada, that are global companies. So this isn't sort of unique to social media. However, these are global in a fairly unique sense in that they're building products that are used by people all over the world, and they're largely based in the United States. There's a few ways around that, though. One is this bill has pretty big penalties in it, up to 3% of global revenue. That is a pretty big stick, and it's similar, although a little bit less than what's been imposed in other jurisdictions. So one, you can penalize them. Two, we are not asking for very many things in this bill that aren't already being complied with in other jurisdictions. So the Online News Act was actually a little bit different. We were a bit ahead of the curve on that one.
Right.
And companies were kind of trying to set a precedent to stop us from doing it, or to stop other countries from following suit. This is a bit different. I mean, risk assessments are being asked for in the EU. Age-appropriate design codes are already in effect in the UK. These age restrictions are, to varying effect, present in Australia. So we're not first here. So the idea that this can't be done is a far more difficult argument. The final piece here is that this only applies, or will in very high likelihood apply, to the very large companies. So the large social media companies and the very large consumer-facing AI companies. And the costs to them of not complying are actually pretty high. Like, these are companies that are normalized in all aspects of our economy and our lives. And the cost of them just leaving the Canadian market, let alone the European market or the British market, are incredibly high. And I think broadly, there's a pretty high likelihood that this is going to set a new bar and they will comply.
Well, it's interesting on that, Taylor Owen, because we've had people on the show talking about this over the course of the last number of weeks, and Supriya Dwivedi, who you would know reasonably, she was on the show last night, and she made the point that a kid's feed in Europe is already better than a kid's feed here in Canada. It's going back to the minister's point that we're catching up with the other. So this getting to a higher collective standard is the trick in trying to make it enforceable on these global giants. Yeah,
and there's a tricky dynamic here where most of these kinds of regulations have to be done by the nation state. There aren't really any multilateral agreements or international organizations that can do this collectively. So it's a national endeavor. But we want to make sure that there's some degree of alignment between what each country is asking of these companies. And that just raises the bar of compliance, because these companies reasonably, I think, don't want to have entirely different rules for every jurisdiction. So as much as possible, I think Canada should be asking for similar things as other peer nations.
Right.
And this bill broadly does that. It pushes a couple of things forward, and that's how this works. A country tries things. Hopefully, we all learn from it. And then the next country that brings on a policy regime learns from it and iterates. And I think this is largely that. It is an iteration of what we know has worked and not worked in other jurisdictions.
Taylor Owen, founding director of the Center for Media Technology and Democracy and associate professor of public policy at McGill University. We appreciate the time. Thank you, sir.
Anytime. See you soon.